this is where I started work. I was 14 years old. This was my first job. Probably, you know, I just left school, had a week's holiday.
Had a week's holiday?
Yeah. Great, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And then came down here to start.
And what year would that be, Fred?
That would be 1938.
1938?
Yeah.
Wow.
First job, probably August 38.
Yeah. And what would you have earned then, Fred?
I don't know. I can't quite. I think my first pay packet was probably 12 and sixpence.
12 and 6.
Yeah. I think that was it.
So would you show me around? Would you take
We'll
me
have a
through
wander
the
down and
see what we can find?
See what we can find.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lovely.
I don't think I haven't any closer. I used to start at 7 o'clock in the morning. Get here and probably go in and light the fire in the old stove.
The old tortoise stove.
That's the tortoise stove, yeah. Slow but sure, but used to heat up well, and the pipe went up through the roof, you know, and along a bit, and helped to dry the wares out there, so it was all right.
Yeah. And you worked for, who was your boss?
Messick was the, Mr. Messick Sims, he was the sort of potter man, you know, head potter, and Alfie done a bit of glazing, and Bert Bailey, he was the other potter, so.
Oh, he potted as well.
And then at 5 o'clock you were allowed to go home, so that was it.
How did you get that? Up on the top of the cupboard, you can see these wonderful big bushel pans. I think they're magnificent pots, and they're probably about 40 to 50 pounds worth of clay. They were part of the set. You had a bushel, a quart and a peck pan. They were sold in sets. When we chose a logo for the Trust, we actually chose this pot here, which is known as a Dorset owl because of the two lugs or handles, a Dorset owl or a costrel, because this is really the pot which is so renowned for this industry in East Dorset. However, I've often thought that the little pitcher, which has also become very much renowned for a Verwood pot, with its lovely low slung-bellied shape, is a very close pot to one for being chosen as perhaps being the logo for the Trust. I love this particular pot because it's got these wonderful firing marks showing where another pot was leaning against it and where the flames have licked round the vessels. So this is a little pitcher, as they're called, and they come in all sizes. You can get really tiny ones to really large ones.
When I visit old potteries, or nowadays go to a museum and I learn about Verwood and the different shapes, from the sort of Dorset owl to this remarkably shaped pitcher, it must be the lowest slung belly of any traditional pitcher that I can think of. From these islands, you know, this has got a good weight, and it's quite light. It's earthenware, and earthenware, in many cases, does pick up rather lightly, you know. But sometimes you can see a shape that purports to be light, and when you go and pick it up,
it's really
you think, oh, it's way down there, and you say to yourself, that clay in that pot has not been distributed fairly, you know.
Did any member of your family recall your grandfather talking about visiting Verwood Potteries, the Crossroads?
Yes, my father talks about it, and he says that his father, Bernard, was struck by the simplicity and primitive kind of atmosphere of the place. He found visits to potteries such as Verwood very interesting because they were so simple and primitive. You know, a man with his oversized cerebral mass is always wanting to get a tool for this and a tool for that, you know. But the further back you go, they'll make one tool do 3 or 4 things, you know. You don't want to be with gadgets all the time. So the simple way of producing pots, such as the Verwood potters, and the simple and rather primitive kiln, it must have been in the 20th century a kiln, the most primitive kiln that lasted as long as it did. Then you look at these old boys who've been, they had to make 1,000 a day. And that's not just an ordinary 8-hour day. That's probably nearer a 10-hour day, you know. 1,000 plus little 3-inch flower pots in order to get a little bit of jam with their bread, you know.
I'd love to talk a little bit about the perfume brick. It was made in a little brass mould, and I gather that Fred Fry used to make them. And essentially it was used, when it was made, it was sent to Corfe Mullen to be impregnated with lavender. And I imagine ladies used it in their airing cupboard or in their drawers. And then down here we got this wonderful pot, which is a cream dish. Isn't that wonderful? Great big pot. I can remember my grandmother, not in earthenware, but I can remember her making butter when she was on the farm. And, you know, you'd put the milk in here and then you'd gradually skim the cream off and put it in a jug. And then eventually, I can remember sitting watching butter being made. And you don't get many of these. This is a really wonderful, wonderful cream dish.
I remember Harold Churchill telling me that when he worked on the wheel, and you used to work, didn't you? You used to
turn the
wheel, that when they were making the big pots, that the boys would be a bit naughty and go a bit slow, and they'd get a lump of clay thrown at them and be told off.
We didn't know about that. I don't know. They might have done, but you had to be very careful when you were doing the big pots. You know, it was hard work to start with. You had to go as fast as you could to start with, but when the pot started to come up and get into shape, you had to go fairly gentle then. If you went too fast, he collapsed, and you had to start all over again.
And then you weren't popular.
Oh no, you were steady boy, let it go, steady boy.
And those big pots were sort of 30 to 40 pounds worth of clay.
Yeah, I suppose it was really, because it was a terrific lump. I have no idea. They used to weigh it out. I know it was all weighed out, you know. So.
Can you remember what sort of pots did you make? I mean, those big pots we know as bushel pans, don't we?
And there was a smaller one, half bushel, I think.
Bushel, yeah.
And then, of course, they went smaller then and down. And they made pitchers as well, jugs, you know. And they flower pots. Yeah. And the little tummers, as they call them.
And you love making the tummers, didn't you?
Oh my gosh, didn't they? They'd go, you know, you had to go as fast as you could all the time.
Did you?
And they just go down and up and wire them off and put them on the tray and back on another one. And
did you ever do any glazing at all?
No, I didn't do that, because whoever done the glazing had to go for a medical every month or something.
That's right,
you know,
because they didn't use pure lead at this time, did they? They used a galena, wasn't it?
Yeah, something, I don't know what it was, but I know Alf used to have to go along and...
Did he?
Yeah, get a tester.
He was obviously fine though, because I mean he lived to 92, didn't he?
Yeah, he was all right.
Essentially, because the last pottery that survived, the Crossroads Pottery, was known within living history, and you had people who worked in it, people involved in some way. Even local people remember buying pots there. So when we started off the research, although it was essentially East Dorset, everybody knew it as Verwood ware. However, the area that the actual industry covers is much bigger. When we started off, we had about 10 sites. Now we have 42 sites, and they really stretch from Wimborne right through to Dameron, even touching the borders of Hampshire. And from documentary evidence, we know that in Dameron, they were potting there in 1260. And looking down into Wimborne, if you go through the church warden's accounts for the minster, you find that they were buying pots for acoustic purposes in the minster. In fact, if you go to Tarrant Rushton Church, you can still see the pots in situ. Sadly, there aren't any in the minster now. So essentially, the industry itself, and probably goes back much earlier. People often chat about, well, it must have been connected with the Roman kilns in the New Forest. And I'm sure it's just simply where there was clay, you had pots. People made pots. So I'm sure that we'll find evidence of early potting at some time. I just hope it's within my research years, because I'd really like to find the medieval kilns. Well, we know from a lot of documents that a lot of the relatives sold the pots, but I think a good example is a letter of 1854, which came from the Salisbury archives, and it's a letter from Mr. Key, gentleman of Alderholt, to Lord Salisbury, asking for his support for the hawkers who are being charged for a licence for hawking or selling their ware. The letter obviously is an appeal and could be a little bit exaggerated, but I don't think too much. He describes 4 of the potteries and the people that support the potteries, about 120 people helping. And if you think about it, really, they had to collect wood. It took a ton of wood to fire the pottery. People had to dig the clay. People helped in the potteries. And I'm sure, and we've got evidence, that rather like children of today do paper round, that the youngsters then would have gone to help in the potteries and, do odd little jobs there. But essentially, the industry as a whole began to decline in the 18th century. Other forms were coming in, the railway was moving in later on and bringing in pottery from Stoke-on-Trent. Poole pottery was getting very diverse with its forms. And so the little country potteries, well, enamel was coming in, galvanised. If you dropped one of these pots, you smashed it. If you dropped a galvanised, it was probably a bit dented. So really, particularly in the 20th century, the potters then tried desperately to keep going. They tried anything they could to produce something which was a little more attractive, a little more upmarket. But it just gradually faded out. And we always say that it's sad, really, because if it had survived to the 60s, when the revival of the craft industry as a whole was coming about, it might well have survived. But sadly, Crossroads closed just before the coronation, I imagine, sometime about that time. And it just seemed to fade away.
Funny, that's where the storage sheds were, you say, around there. Bring the stuff down and put it in there. Mm-hmm. And then the kiln would be round where that bungalow is now. That was when the bungalow was built, the kiln was literally destroyed, And then you went on round and you had the main building round the other side.
Mm-hmm. And you had where you stoked the fire for the kiln was the far side, was it? The back side?
Yeah. And the wood and all that was brought in and put up round the back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's marvellous, Fred. That's really good to hear all these things, and I hope you come and see us during the excavation as things develop.
I'll probably look in. Yeah.
Great.
No, I will. Yeah.
Well, let's go see if we can find a cup of tea, shall we?
Very good idea.
Okay.
Good idea.
on site, we are really digging the area which is the working area. The kiln was dismantled in the late 50s, and we're now looking at all the sheds and pit groups that would have come about as a result of over probably what would have been 200 years of potting. Because in the evaluation which AC Archaeology did, we found bits of manganese ware, which is a dark chocolate brown. We didn't know that Crossroads Pottery produced this type of ware, so the evaluation really proved that a bigger excavation had to take place to find out what was going on. We knew that the kiln was working in 1812, and then we found this wonderful pit group, which is bringing out pottery dated 1750 and possibly even earlier. In Salisbury Museum, you have two puzzle jugs, which are dated 1603, 1604. They have the initials WZ. This pottery is labelled as Wiltshire brownware, but I believe that it was produced by our kilns, and in particular maybe involved with a family called Zebedee, who were potting over at Crendell. And having found manganese ware here, it's become even more important to find out the extent of this manganese ware. And I think it was sort of probably on these kilns, maybe they were producing a finer ware, which was the sort of brown ware, apart from the usual sort of utilitarian domestic ware. And having found it here, it gives us an opportunity to encourage somebody to do a PhD on it and be able to once and for all find out that our kilns were producing, and it's not Wiltshire ware, it's Dorset ware.
This is a TIG. They would have come in various sizes and would have had 2, 3, 4 or 5 handles. That was the idea, being that they would put in a whole hot mulled ale, and then it would have been a communal dish and passed round the table. And obviously you wouldn't want to handle a hot vessel, so having several handles would avoid anybody being burnt. That's the theory behind them. And it's this wonderful manganese glaze which I'm so interested in researching. And that came out of the pit group, which is proving at the moment to be a date around 1750. This one is the rare pot that we've had out, which is for distilling. You can see that it's got a hollow inside with a rim and a little place for where the liquid would have come out. Again, this is around the same date, and I've got a picture of how it would have worked. What we have is the top bit here, bit A. It's called an alembic pot, which is a wonderful name. This is the pit group, which is showing these lovely pots that we've found. A lot of nearly all the forms that we've seen so far are dated 18th century. And we've got this distilling pot and a lot of tigs coming out. And the whole of the pit is going to be removed. And I'm just so excited, I can't wait to see what forms. We've got some more forms in there that we haven't seen before. It's very exciting. Further than that, we haven't yet really worked out what is happening here. It's a vast pit. So I can see already in the section here some decorated and different forms that I haven't seen before.
Well, my name's Graham Zebedee, and my ancestors apparently have been in Crendell in Dorset, near Cranbourne, as far as we know, since parish records began. I think Penny Trace has been doing some research, and I think we're in about the early 1600s. She's gone back to, and she tells me that my William Zebedee, who was the potter at Crendell, I think I'm about the 5th generation from him, more or less. And I just find the whole sort of pottery setup, with the history of all the potting just very, very interesting, because this is the first archaeological site I've been on, and it's something I've always wanted to do in life, and it's got a great significance for me, being, having relations connected with the potteries.
I've had a few excavations on a few kiln sites, but although we haven't got a kiln as such here, it's the bringing together of all the societies. I think that's really become very important to me, and I feel this is a wonderful opportunity. The history of it, the rare pots that we're finding out of this pit group, I just get so wildly excited, and I've been doing the research since 1972 and never lose the excitement of another dig, another kiln, more information and more people getting involved. Leslie Haywood, who's Honorary Curator of Poole Pottery Museum, met one of my members. They were meeting for supper, and he talked to this chap about a film that had been sent to him by an old cinema from Derbyshire. And my friend looked at it and said, might be an idea if you showed it to Penny, because it was in an old tin, clearly a very old film. It had Dorset Potteries on it. So a meeting was set up, and as I now realise, perhaps we shouldn't have done it quite in this fashion, but we took the film out. We had a white sheet. We rolled it very carefully over the sheet, and I recognised the kiln itself from the old newspaper cutting, which was the same view. And Leslie Haywood at the time very kindly said, "Here you are, donate it to the trust." I've done a little research on it, though it needs to be extensively researched. It was made by Charles Urban. It was known as Urban Aura. We were able to date it because my friend Len Sims, he's also known as Alfie Sims, because there were two Lens, I believe. I took it to show him, and he recognised himself on the film. And his sister, who was looking at the film at the same time, said, "That's Leonard," she said. "I know Leonard anywhere. He always turned up his long johns in that fashion," which was a wonderful identification.
In 1903 I was born, October 22nd, in Verwood, near the parish church. Old cottage up there, pulled down now. There's new bungalows put up along there. They put the lumps on the floor, sanded floor, 500 or 600 weight, I expect. And then tread it out about that thick, yes, and then roll it up several times and do it again. That's the same as a lady with a pastry. Most of it come from Hull. That's the best up Hull. But we had some from the brickyard down near the station. There was a lot of stones. For winter, we used to go out on the common and cut the turf and bring it in and set fire to it in the room. The floor was hot, yes. There was two kilns, one big one and a smaller one. They're side by side. On top of the kiln, there's all pots and that round, different ones. Then we used put on big shards, then a layer of small ones on top before we burn. Help keep the heat and smoke could get out. Well, we had to leave it for several days, but before we take it out, if you open them too soon, it would crack. The steam would cut the clay and that, and wouldn't be no good then. If they were too bad, they break them up. We used to start off with a very small wood, like brushwood, then gradually bring it up, bigger wood than that, till the last few hours. Then they put on some brushwood, like faggots. They had to buy the wood, some of it from Normanton's estate, around different places. Small little jugs were 6pence, and the biggest ones were about half a crown.